Did you know that a wave of UFOs is sweeping across Europe? But what nobody expected was that the same phenomenon would cross the Atlantic and transform American skies into a battlefield of mysteries and terror. The screens went red all at once. Sarah Mitchell, air traffic controller at Chicago O'Hare, felt her heart stop when Flight 447 from Boston appeared on collision course with something that shouldn't exist. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio, raw panic bleeding through his training. "Tower, we have visual on an object, triangular formation, it's moving against the wind, impossible maneuvers." 447, alter course immediately, 20 degrees north. Sarah's hands shook as she tracked the blip on radar. The object wasn't just fast. It was dancing, accelerating, stopping mid-air, changing direction without deceleration. Physics didn't work that way. Nothing worked that way. 183 passengers held their breath as the Boeing 737 banked hard, overhead bins bursting open, screams filling the cabin. The object passed within 300 feet. Close enough that passengers in window seats would later describe a darkness that seemed to absorb light, edges that blurred reality itself. When 447 landed safely 20 minutes later, Sarah locked herself in the bathroom and threw up. She'd been controlling air traffic for 11 years. She'd guided planes through hurricanes, engine failures, bird strikes. But this was different. This was impossible. By midnight, O'Hare had logged 7 similar incidents. By dawn, it was 43 airports across 17 states. The objects appeared without warning, over Seattle, Dallas, Miami, New York. Always near critical infrastructure. Always moving with intelligence that seemed to mock human understanding. The FAA issued a statement calling them weather anomalies and drone activity. But Sarah had seen the classified footage from LaGuardia where an object accelerated from 0 to 3,000 miles per hour in 2.4 seconds. Weather doesn't do that. Drones can't do that. Her phone buzzed. Text from her supervisor, conference room. "Now, bring nobody." The room was packed with people who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Military uniforms mixed with suits she recognized from Homeland Security briefings. A woman in Air Force blues started the presentation without introduction. "What you're about to see is classified top secret. 57 commercial flights have reported near collisions in the past 72 hours. We've documented objects over nuclear facilities, military bases, power grids. They're not random. They're coordinated." The screen showed night vision footage from an F-22 intercept over Nevada. The pilot's voice was steady, professional. "I have visual, unknown craft, no heat signature, no radar cross-section, it's just there." Then the object moved. Straight up. Vertical acceleration that should have generated a sonic boom that shattered windows for miles. Instead, silence. Just a blur on thermal imaging and empty sky. "We're calling it Operation Phantom Eye," the Air Force officer continued. "Because we can see them, but we can't explain them. And we can't stop them." Sarah felt ice spreading through her chest. This wasn't just about air traffic anymore. This was about something that had invaded American airspace with technology that made the most advanced fighter jets look like paper airplanes. What are these objects, and why can't the most powerful military in the world identify them? Why now? Why are they appearing at this specific moment in history? The officer pulled up a map dotted with red pins. Hundreds of them. Each one an incident, a sighting, a near disaster prevented by seconds and luck. They started in Europe 3 months ago. Everyone thought it was isolated. Then they crossed the Atlantic. Now they're here, and they're escalating. A CIA analyst spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "We need to consider that this might be a prelude. A test. That someone is mapping our defenses, finding our weaknesses, preparing for something bigger." Sarah thought about Flight 447. About those 183 passengers who came within 300 feet of something that defied reality. About her daughter Emma, 6 years old, who wanted to be a pilot when she grew up. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice smaller than she intended. The room fell silent. Because nobody had an answer. Not the generals with their medals and strategies. Not the intelligence analysts with their data and projections. Not the politicians with their reassurances and press conferences. The impossible had arrived in American skies. And it was watching. Waiting. Testing. Sarah drove home as the sun rose, the radio cycling through news reports that danced around the truth. Unexplained aerial phenomena, they called it. Increased drone activity. Anything but the word that terrified everyone. Unknown. She kissed Emma goodbye before school, holding her daughter a little longer than usual. And she wondered if she'd just witnessed the beginning of something that would change everything. The objects kept coming. Every night, more sightings. Every day, more questions without answers. And somewhere in a command center buried beneath the Pentagon, analysts were starting to piece together a pattern that would crack the mystery wide open, revealing a threat far more dangerous than anyone imagined. If you're captivated by this unfolding mystery and want to discover what these objects truly are, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because what comes next will shake everything you thought you knew about our place in the world. 3 days after the O'Hare incidents, the first casualty arrived. Private First Class Marcus Webb, 22 years old, stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado, was found in his barracks with severe neurological damage. He'd been part of a patrol unit that encountered one of the objects hovering 200 feet above the base perimeter. The medical report Sarah obtained through her growing network of military contacts made her blood run cold. Acute electromagnetic exposure, brain hemorrhaging consistent with directed energy weapons, symptoms that matched nothing in conventional warfare databases. Marcus would never walk again. Never speak again. His mother sat beside his hospital bed in Walter Reed, holding the hand of a son who could no longer recognize her face. That's when Sarah understood, these weren't just surveillance drones. They were weapons. And someone was testing them on American soil. Who would dare attack the United States so brazenly, and why aren't we fighting back? The classified briefings became daily rituals. Sarah found herself pulled deeper into a shadow world where the truth was compartmentalized across agencies that barely spoke to each other. The CIA had satellite data. The Air Force had intercept footage. The NSA had signals intelligence. But nobody was connecting the pieces until a defense intelligence analyst named David Chen walked into the operations center with a presentation that changed everything. "They're not random," David announced, his voice cutting through the exhausted chatter. "Look at the pattern." He projected a three-dimensional map of North America, timestamps flowing like a digital river. Every single incident occurs within 20 miles of critical infrastructure, nuclear facilities, military command centers, undersea communications cables, power grid junction points. Sarah leaned forward, her controller instincts kicking in. "They're mapping our defenses." "Not just mapping," David corrected, zooming in on the data. "Testing response times. Every time we scramble jets, they measure how long it takes. Every time we activate radar, they analyze our frequencies. They're building a complete profile of American defensive capabilities." The Air Force general slammed his fist on the table. "Then who the hell is they? China? Russia? Some tech billionaire with a god complex?" David's next slide answered the question nobody wanted to ask. Satellite imagery from Estonia, Poland, Romania. Grainy photographs of mobile launch platforms, communications arrays, the signature of coordinated military operations. The technology signature matches Russian electronic warfare systems. The operational pattern mirrors their hybrid warfare doctrine from the Ukrainian conflict. And 3 days ago, we intercepted a burst transmission from one of these objects. The encryption was SVR, Russian Foreign Intelligence. The room erupted in overlapping voices, accusations, demands for immediate retaliation. But Sarah sat frozen, remembering something her father told her before he died, a career Navy cryptographer who'd spent the Cold War listening to Soviet communications. "The Russians don't just want to defeat you. They want you to defeat yourself. Fear, confusion, paranoia, those are their real weapons." The objects weren't alien. They were Russian advanced drones conducting the largest espionage operation in modern history, exploiting the UFO hysteria to paralyze American decision-making while they mapped every vulnerability in the nation's defenses. But the revelation brought no relief. Because knowing your enemy doesn't help when they're already inside your house. That night, the blackout hit the eastern seaboard. Sarah was driving home when the lights died. Not gradually, simultaneously. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., all the way up to Boston. 40 million people plunged into darkness in 3.2 seconds. Her car radio crackled with emergency broadcasts before cutting to static. Cell towers overwhelmed and failed. Traffic lights dark, hospitals running on backup generators, chaos spreading like infection through cities designed around infrastructure they took for granted. The official explanation came 3 hours later: technical malfunction at a primary relay station. But Sarah had seen the classified report. The malfunction was caused by a directed electromagnetic pulse from an object hovering over the Susquehanna substation. A surgical strike that proved they could cripple the American power grid whenever they chose. In the darkness, people started asking dangerous questions. Why wasn't the government protecting them? What else were they hiding? Social media exploded with conspiracy theories, accusations, the fabric of trust unraveling in real time. Exactly as planned. Sarah sat in her darkened kitchen, Emma sleeping upstairs, and felt a fury so pure it made her hands shake. These weren't soldiers fighting on distant battlefields. This was her daughter's future being held hostage by an enemy using fear as a precision weapon. They were turning Americans against their own government, against each other, weaponizing the unknown to tear apart the social contract that held everything together. The next morning, emergency session at the Pentagon. The president himself on video conference, demanding answers that nobody could provide. "We are the most powerful nation on earth," he said, voice tight with controlled anger. "And you're telling me we're helpless against drones?" "Not helpless, sir," the Air Force Chief of Staff responded, "but restrained. Every time we shoot one down over civilian areas, we risk casualties. They know this. They're using our own rules of engagement against us." David Chin stood, projecting new intelligence that made Sarah's stomach drop. "It's worse than defensive mapping. We've identified objects conducting reconnaissance over water treatment facilities, natural gas pipelines, agricultural distribution centers. They're not just preparing to attack military targets. They're identifying how to create maximum civilian suffering." A CIA director spoke up, his voice heavy with implications. "Moscow wants leverage. They're building a deterrence portfolio, proving they can strike American civilians without firing a single conventional weapon. Starvation, disease, infrastructure collapse. All while maintaining plausible deniability. If Russia can do this, what's stopping them from actually executing the attack they're planning?" The meeting ended with a decision that classified her into an even deeper circle of secrecy: Operation Nightfall. A joint military-civilian task force with one mission: find a way to neutralize the Russian drones before they triggered the catastrophe everyone now saw coming. Sarah became part of a team that included fighter pilots, cyber warfare specialists, signals intelligence analysts, and engineers from defense contractors whose work was so classified they couldn't tell their own families what they did for a living. They worked in shifts around the clock, fueled by coffee and the knowledge that failure meant watching their country descend into chaos. But the pressure was building in ways nobody predicted. Anti-government militias started forming, convinced the UFO invasion was a false flag operation. Foreign adversaries exploited the confusion, spreading disinformation that amplified every conspiracy theory. Trust in institutions, already fragile, began shattering completely. Sarah watched it happen in real time. Her own neighbors stopped talking to each other, eyes filled with suspicion and fear. Emma came home from school crying because another child said the government was lying about aliens. The social fabric was tearing, and everyone could feel it. And somewhere in Moscow, intelligence officers watched American society cannibalize itself and smiled. Because this was always the plan. Not invasion. Not occupation. Just the slow-motion collapse of a superpower eating itself alive. Second major twist. The real weapon wasn't the drones themselves, it was the psychological warfare they enabled. Russia was turning America's greatest strength, its open society and freedom of information, into its deadliest vulnerability. Sarah stood in the operations center at 0300 hours, staring at the wall of screens showing objects hovering over Detroit, Phoenix, Seattle, Atlanta. Silent. Watching. Waiting. David appeared beside her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "We'll figure this out," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. Sarah thought about Marcus Webb in his hospital bed. About 40 million people in the dark. About Emma asking why the adults couldn't fix things anymore. "We better," she whispered. "Because they're not going to stop until we stop them." But stopping an enemy you can't touch, can't predict, and can't even publicly acknowledge, that required something the protocols and procedures never prepared them for. It required someone willing to break every rule to fight a war that officially didn't exist. And Sarah Mitchell was about to become that someone. The idea came to Sarah at 4:17 a.m., staring at footage of a Russian drone executing a turn that no human pilot could survive. She'd been thinking about it wrong. Everyone had been thinking about it wrong. "We can't beat their technology," she told David the next morning, pulling him into an empty conference room. "So we don't try. We beat their strategy." David looked at her like she'd lost her mind from sleep deprivation. "Sarah, these things move at speeds that—" "I know what they can do," she interrupted, spreading printouts across the table. "But look what they can't do. They can't operate in dense electronic interference. Every time they get close to military jamming equipment, they retreat. They need clear signals to communicate with their command center." She pulled up satellite data showing drone movements over the past month. "See this? They avoid certain areas completely. Places with heavy electromagnetic activity, radio telescope arrays, experimental radar installations, even massive server farms. They're autonomous to a point, but they still need to phone home." Sarah's voice cracked as she continued. "Marcus Webb is lying in a hospital bed because we followed protocol. Because we waited for authorization and approval and consensus. While we followed rules, they paralyzed a 22-year-old kid's brain. How many more Marcus Webbs before we stop asking permission?" David studied the data, his analytical mind catching the pattern she'd seen. "If we could create a coordinated electromagnetic barrier across their operational zones, we'd force them into a kill box," Sarah finished. "Somewhere we choose. Somewhere we control." But suggesting the plan to command was impossible. The Joint Chiefs wanted observable evidence, risk assessments, political authorization. Months of bureaucracy while Russian drones mapped every weakness in American infrastructure. Sarah thought about Emma asking why the lights wouldn't turn back on, and made a decision that would either save her country or end her career. She started building a shadow team. First recruit, Captain Jessica Torres, F-22 pilot who'd chased one of the objects over the Pacific and watched it accelerate beyond anything physics allowed. Jessica had been grounded after filing a report claiming the drone had anticipated her maneuvers before she executed them. The Air Force called it combat stress. Jessica called it the truth. "They're reading our tactical frequencies," Jessica explained over encrypted chat. "Processing our communications faster than human reaction time. That's why they always know where we'll be before we get there." Second recruit, Dr. Raymond Park, electronics engineer at DARPA whose experimental jamming system got shelved because it was too indiscriminate for modern warfare. Translation: it knocked out everything electronic in a 5-mile radius, including friendly systems. You want to deploy a weapon that will disable every smartphone, pacemaker, and traffic light in the target zone? Raymond asked when Sarah pitched the plan. "The civilian casualties alone." "Will be 0, Sarah interrupted, "because we're going to evacuate the entire area first. And we're not deploying it in a city. We're using it to create a trap." Third recruit, Lieutenant Marcus Webb's sister, Dr. Alicia Webb, neurologist at Walter Reed who'd spent 3 weeks studying her brother's injuries. She had access to classified medical data on every service member exposed to the Russian drones. What she'd discovered would answer one of their burning questions. The neurological damage isn't random, Alicia revealed, her voice tight with controlled fury. It's calibrated. Precise doses of electromagnetic radiation designed to incapacitate without killing. They're testing weapons-grade directed energy systems on American soldiers to perfect non-lethal warfare. My brother was a human experiment. The pieces were falling into place. Sarah recruited 2 more, a CIA logistics coordinator who could move equipment off books, and a NSA signals analyst who'd been tracking the drone's communication patterns to a satellite relay over the Arctic. They met in person only once, at Sarah's house after Emma was asleep. 6 people who decided that saving the country meant breaking every rule that made them professionals. This is treason if we're wrong, the CIA coordinator said flatly. Court-martial. Prison. End of everything. Sarah looked at each of them. And if we're right, we'll never get credit for it. This stays buried no matter what happens. Because officially, we're not doing anything. Jessica leaned forward. Then tell us what we are doing. Sarah pulled up a map of rural Nevada, an area surrounding the old nuclear test sites, evacuated, isolated, perfect. We're going to make them think we've lost control of a nuclear convoy. Fake an accident in the middle of their surveillance zone. They won't be able to resist getting close, gathering intelligence on American nuclear security protocols. Raymond whistled low. And when they move in, we hit them with every jamming system we can deploy in a 50-mile radius. Cut them off from their command network. Force them to land or crash. Sarah's eyes were hard as steel. And then we capture one intact. Prove to the world what Russia's been doing. Russia was attacking so brazenly because they believed American bureaucracy and fear of civilian casualties made retaliation impossible. They'd calculated that by the time the U.S. decided on a response, they'd have mapped every vulnerability and positioned themselves for permanent deterrence. They were betting on American hesitation. Sarah was about to prove them wrong. The preparation took 11 days. 11 days of moving equipment through unofficial channels, creating fake maintenance schedules, building an operational theater that officially didn't exist. Sarah barely slept, coordinating between team members who communicated only through encrypted apps on burner phones. She watched David present the official strategy to the Joint Chiefs, a defensive posture, increased patrols, diplomatic pressure through NATO. Everything slow and measured and completely inadequate. And she said nothing, because the real plan was happening in shadows. Emma noticed her mother's absence. "Are you fighting the scary lights in the sky?" she asked one morning, her 6-year-old face serious beyond her years. Sarah knelt down, holding her daughter's hands. "I'm trying to make sure you never have to be scared of them again." "Will you win?" The question hung in the air, weighted with a child's absolute faith that adults could fix anything. Sarah thought about Marcus Webb, about 40 million people in the dark, about a future where her daughter grew up in a country too paralyzed by fear to defend itself. "Yes, baby. We're going to win." But doubt gnawed at her during the long nights of final preparation. They were 6 people with salvaged equipment and a plan that violated every protocol, facing an adversary with technology decades beyond anything in the American arsenal. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was suicide. On the drive to Nevada, Sarah pulled over on an empty highway and cried for the first time since this started. Cried for Marcus Webb and his stolen future. Cried for Emma growing up in a world that felt increasingly broken. Cried for the version of herself who followed rules and trusted systems and believed that doing the right thing was always enough. Then she wiped her face, started the engine, and drove toward the trap they'd built. The fake nuclear convoy was perfect. 3 trucks with the right markings, escort vehicles, even falsified movement orders in the military logistics system. They positioned Dr. Park's jamming equipment in concealed bunkers arranged in a geometric pattern around the site. Jessica had 2 F-22s on standby at a base 60 miles away, pilots who'd been told this was an unscheduled training exercise. Everything was ready. Now they just needed the Russian drones to take the bait. Sarah stood in the mobile command center, really just a reinforced trailer with computer equipment, watching radar screens that showed empty sky. The convoy had been stalled for 3 hours. Intelligence suggested Russian satellites had already spotted it. But would they send the drones? Contact, the NSA analyst suddenly announced. 3 objects inbound from the northwest, speed. Jesus, Mach 4 and accelerating. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Distance to kill zone? 40 miles. 35. They're coming in fast. This was it. The moment that would either expose the largest espionage operation in history or end 6 careers in spectacular failure. Sarah thought about Emma, about the promise she'd made, about Marcus Webb staring at a ceiling he couldn't comprehend. 20 miles. She reached for the activation switch on Dr. Park's jamming system. 15 miles. They're slowing down. Adjusting approach vector. They appeared now because Russia was preparing for something bigger. The drones weren't just surveillance, they were the advance guard for a comprehensive hybrid warfare campaign timed to coincide with global instability. Map American defenses now. Strike when the country was most divided and vulnerable. The timeline was accelerating because they sensed American paralysis. 10 miles. Multiple vectors, they're splitting up. Trying to surround the convoy. Sarah's finger hovered over the switch. Wait for it. Wait until they're committed. 5 miles. They're positioning for. She slammed the activation button. The electromagnetic pulse erupted in a sphere of invisible energy that turned the Nevada desert into a dead zone of fried electronics. Sarah's own screens flickered and died, backup generators kicking in as the kill zone became a technological void. 4-5 seconds. Nothing happened. Sarah stood in darkness, wondering if they'd just failed catastrophically. Then Jessica's voice crackled over the hardened radio system. I have visual. 2 objects down, repeat. 2 objects down in the kill zone. Third is, it's trying to climb out, losing altitude, it's contact. 3rd object down. The trailer erupted in shouts of triumph and disbelief. They'd done it. They'd actually brought down 3 Russian military drones with technology that officially didn't exist, in an operation that never happened. But Sarah felt no relief. Because now came the hard part, getting to those drones before Russia realized what had happened and destroyed the evidence. Getting proof to people who didn't want to believe. Fighting a war that her own government might disavow. She grabbed the radio. All teams, move to recovery positions. We have maybe 30 minutes before this entire site is swarming with people asking questions we can't answer. David appeared beside her in the darkness, illuminated only by emergency lights. Sarah, if this works, if we actually prove what they've been doing. Then we started a war, she finished quietly. Just not the kind anyone was expecting. Outside, recovery teams were already moving toward the crash sites, racing against time and consequences. Sarah watched them go and thought about a 6-year-old girl who believed her mother could fix anything. Time to prove her right. The first drone lay half buried in Nevada sand, its black surface still crackling with residual electromagnetic discharge. Sarah's hands trembled as she approached, tactical flashlight cutting through the darkness. Up close, it was smaller than she expected, maybe 8 feet across, edges that seemed to blur even when motionless. Don't touch it yet, Dr. Park warned, his detector screaming with radiation warnings. Still emitting. Give it 2 minutes to fully discharge. Those 2 minutes felt like hours. Sarah could hear helicopter rotors in the distance, unauthorized aircraft incoming fast. They'd anticipated this. The question was whether those helicopters carried American forces sent to shut down their rogue operation, or Russian special forces sent to destroy evidence. Jessica's voice crackled through the radio. We've got company. 3 helicopters, no transponders, coming in hot from the northwest. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Northwest was the direction of the Russian consulate in San Francisco. ETA. 8 minutes. Then we work fast. Sarah turned to her recovery team. Get cutting equipment on this thing now. We don't need the whole drone, just the communication module and flight control system. Proof of origin. The next 6 minutes were chaos. Plasma cutters screaming against alien-looking metal alloys. Dr. Park extracting components while shouting technical specifications into a recording device. Alicia documenting everything with military-grade cameras. The CIA coordinator already uploading encrypted files to multiple secure servers across 3 continents. 5 minutes. Jessica warned. Sarah watched the cutting team struggle with material that seemed to resist every tool they had. Sweat poured down her face despite the cold desert night. Everything they'd risked, careers, freedom, maybe their lives, came down to getting inside this machine before Russian commandos arrived to turn the site into a smoking crater. The cutter finally broke through. Dr. Park reached inside with hands wrapped in protective gear, extracting what looked like a crystalline circuit board pulsing with faint light. Got it. This is the neural processor, the brain of the entire system. Bag it, move. Sarah ordered. Everyone to extraction vehicles, now. That's when the shooting started. Rounds kicked up sand 10 feet from Sarah's position. She hit the ground hard, flashlights spinning away. The Russian helicopters hadn't waited to land, they were engaging from the air, trying to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses in one strike. Jessica's F-22s screamed overhead, forcing the helicopters to break off their attack run. But Sarah knew those pilots couldn't fire without starting an international incident. They could only intimidate by time. Not enough time. A second wave of gunfire, closer now. Sarah army crawled toward the nearest vehicle, watching her team scatter. Dr. Park clutched the extracted components like a father protecting his child. Alicia was shouting coordinates into her radio. The CIA coordinator was. The explosion knocked Sarah sideways. One of the recovery vehicles erupted in flames, secondary detonations cooking off equipment. The Russian commandos had anti-tank weapons. Sarah! David's voice through her earpiece, frantic. The official response team is 30 minutes out. You need to evacuate now, or they'll have you all in custody for unauthorized military operations. Trapped between Russian commandos trying to kill them and American forces coming to arrest them. Sarah laughed, a sound verging on hysteria. This was how it ended, not in triumph but in a firefight that would be classified and buried along with everyone involved. Then the sky lit up. Not explosions. Light. Pure, blinding white light that turned night into artificial day. Sarah shielded her eyes, trying to understand what was happening. The Russian helicopters banked hard, retreat patterns, fleeing from what? Sarah, are you seeing this? Jessica's voice carried a note of awe and terror. There are 6 more objects incoming. Bigger than anything we've tracked. They're not Russian. The signatures are completely different. Sarah's tactical mind tried to process the impossible. If the drones they'd captured were Russian, then what were these? The new objects descended in perfect geometric formation, each one the size of a school bus. They didn't move like the Russian drones, no aggressive maneuvers, no erratic patterns. Just steady, inevitable approach. And as they got closer, Sarah saw something that made her question everything they'd assumed. They were damaged. Scorched. Battle-scarred. One of them projected a holographic display in mid-air, mathematical equations, chemical formulas, star charts. A message. But not for Russia or America. For everyone. Dr. Park stood transfixed, his scientific mind racing. Those equations, they're describing atmospheric composition changes. Carbon dioxide levels rising. Temperature models. They're showing us Earth's climate data. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Russian drones weren't the only thing in American skies. There were others. Had been others. Watching. Studying. Documenting humanity's slow self-destruction. The hologram shifted, showing footage that couldn't exist. Cities underwater, forest fires consuming continents, mass migrations of desperate populations. Not predictions. Observations from somewhere else, some other world that had followed the same path. "They're not invading," Alicia whispered. "They're warning us." But before Sarah could process the implications, the Russian helicopters regrouped for another attack run. They weren't fleeing anymore. They were targeting the new objects, desperate to destroy whatever message was being delivered. The new objects responded instantly. Beams of coherent light, not weapons, more like surgical instruments, disabled the Russian helicopters' electronics without destroying them. The aircraft auto-rotated down in forced landings, pilots shaken but alive. Then the objects turned toward Sarah's position. She stood frozen, the extracted Russian components in Dr. Park's hands suddenly feeling insignificant. They'd been fighting over espionage technology while something infinitely more complex had been observing the whole human race. The lead object descended to within 20 feet. Close enough that Sarah could see symbols etched into its surface, mathematical constants that appeared in quantum physics, the golden ratio pi. Universal language. It projected one final image. Earth as seen from space, beautiful and fragile, wrapped in a thin atmosphere that was the only thing between humanity and the void. Then they accelerated upward and were gone. The desert fell silent except for the crackle of burning vehicles and the distant sound of American military helicopters finally arriving. Sarah stood in the aftermath, holding evidence of Russian espionage in one hand and the weight of cosmic perspective in the other. David appeared beside her, face pale in the dying firelight. "Sarah, what just happened?" She thought about the question nobody had asked. Why now? Why were the Russian drones appearing at this specific moment? Because they knew. Russian intelligence had detected the other objects months ago in European skies. The espionage campaign wasn't just about American defenses. It was about understanding what else was out there, what was watching, what humanity might be facing. Moscow had been preparing for the wrong war. They'd been so focused on geopolitical advantage that they'd missed the bigger picture entirely. And America had been so paralyzed by bureaucracy and fear that they'd almost missed it too. The American helicopters landed in formation, troops pouring out. Sarah saw the insignia, Joint Special Operations Command. The official version of what they'd done unofficially. An officer approached, weapon ready, face hard. "Sarah Mitchell? You're under arrest for unauthorized military operations, theft of government property, and..." "Here." Sarah handed him the Russian components. Neural processor from an SVR surveillance drone. Proof of the largest espionage operation in modern history. Analysis will show Russian military encryption, command protocols linking directly to Moscow. "You're welcome." The officer stared at the components, then at the downed Russian helicopters, then at the burned drone still half buried in sand. His tactical mind recalculating the situation. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice carrying exhaustion and something like wonder. "But that part doesn't go in your report. That part stays with the people who were here to witness it. Because some truths were too big for official channels. Some realities required humanity to grow up before it could handle them." Sarah looked at her team, beaten, burned, facing courts-martial and imprisonment, and saw people who'd just been granted perspective that changed everything. The Russian drones had been testing American defenses. But something else had been testing human wisdom. And in the Nevada desert, surrounded by the wreckage of human paranoia and ambition, Sarah understood that the real war wasn't between nations. It was between humanity's worst impulses and its potential to be better. The officer spoke into his radio, words Sarah couldn't hear. Then he lowered his weapon. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you and your team to come with me. But, between us? Command says whatever you did here tonight just prevented something catastrophic. The details are above my pay grade." Sarah nodded, too tired to feel relief. They'd stopped the Russian espionage operation. Captured proof. Prevented the infrastructure attacks that would have plunged the country into chaos. And glimpsed something that suggested the stakes were infinitely higher than any of them had imagined. As they loaded into the military helicopters, Sarah looked up at the clear Nevada sky and wondered how many other civilizations were watching Earth right now, hoping humanity would choose survival over self-destruction. The answer, she suspected, would determine everything. The debriefing lasted 48 hours. Sarah sat in a windowless Pentagon room answering the same questions in different configurations, while lawyers and intelligence officers tried to determine whether she was a hero or a traitor. The line, it turned out, was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. They never charged her. Couldn't. Because the Russian components she'd extracted proved everything: encrypted communications linking directly to SVR headquarters, targeting algorithms for American infrastructure, evidence of directed energy weapons tested on U.S. soil. The kind of proof that turned whispers of conspiracy into congressional hearings and diplomatic crises. Within a week, the Secretary of State was in emergency sessions with NATO allies. Russia faced sanctions that made previous measures look like gentle suggestions. 3 SVR officers were expelled from the San Francisco consulate. The drones stopped appearing over American cities. But Sarah knew the victory was incomplete. Because the other objects, the ones that had descended during the firefight, those stayed classified at levels that didn't officially exist. The footage was confiscated. The witnesses were sworn to silence under national security orders that carried prison sentences measured in decades. The official story became simple: Russian espionage operation, detected and neutralized through routine intelligence work. Sarah Mitchell's name appeared nowhere in the reports. Neither did David's, Jessica's, Dr. Park's, Alicia's, or the CIA coordinator whose actual name Sarah never learned. They met one final time, at Sarah's house 3 weeks later. Emma was at her grandmother's. The 6 of them sat in the living room where they'd first planned their impossible operation, and nobody spoke for a long time. Jessica broke the silence. "I put in my resignation yesterday. The Air Force accepted it with suspicious enthusiasm. They offered me early retirement," David added. "Generous pension. All I have to do is never talk about Nevada." Dr. Park laughed, a bitter sound. "DARPA transferred me to a research facility in Alaska. As far from decision-making as they could send me without actually firing me." Sarah understood. They'd saved the country and been rewarded with exile. Too dangerous to punish, too inconvenient to celebrate. The system's perfect solution for people who refused to let protocol trump survival. "Marcus woke up yesterday," Alicia said quietly, her voice cracking. Everyone turned to look at her. "Partial consciousness. He can't speak yet, can't move his right side. But he recognized me. Started crying when I told him what happened, what we did." The room fell silent again, this time heavy with the weight of what that meant. A 22-year-old kid whose brain had been used as a Russian weapons test, now aware enough to understand he'd been avenged. Aware enough to know his future was still stolen. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "Was it worth it?" she asked, the question directed at no one and everyone. "Everything we did, everything we risked, did we actually change anything?" The CIA coordinator, who'd finally introduced herself as Claire, leaned forward. "The infrastructure attacks that were planned for November? The ones targeting water systems and hospitals? Those got scrubbed when we captured the drones. Russian intelligence realized we could track their technology, identify their methods. They called it off." She paused. "Conservative estimates say we prevented somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 American deaths." Numbers. Statistics. The kind of victory that never made headlines because the tragedy never happened. Sarah thought about Emma asking if she'd won, and realized she couldn't give her daughter a simple answer. Because they'd won the battle, but the war, the real war, was just beginning. The doorbell rang. Sarah opened it to find a courier with an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single photograph, Earth from space, taken from an angle no human satellite occupied. On the back, handwritten in perfect English, "Watching. Hoping." She showed it to the others. Dr. Park studied it with scientific intensity, then looked up with eyes that had seen the impossible and been forever changed. "They're still out there. The ones we saw in Nevada. Still observing. Judging? Jessica asked. Hoping, Sarah corrected, remembering the holographic display of a dying world. They've seen this before. Watched other civilizations reach the point where technology outpaces wisdom. Seen them choose destruction over growth. David stood, walked to the window overlooking Sarah's quiet suburban street. Kids playing basketball, neighbors washing cars, the mundane beauty of a world that had no idea how close it had come to chaos. So what do we do now? We can't talk about what we saw. Can't warn anyone. Can't prepare them. Sarah joined him at the window, watching Emma's empty swing move in the breeze. We live like it matters. Every choice, every moment. We teach our kids to think beyond borders and fear. We become the adults who refuse to let paranoia and tribalism define humanity's future. She turned back to her team, her friends, scattered across a living room that had witnessed the planning of something that officially never happened. Russia used our fear against us. Weaponized uncertainty to paralyze us. They almost succeeded. Not because their technology was superior, but because we forgot that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act despite it. Alicia wiped her eyes. Marcus asked me something yesterday, when he could barely form words. He asked if we gave up when things got impossible. What did you tell him? That 6 people decided the rules mattered less than the outcome. That sometimes saving the world means coloring outside the lines that powerful people draw to keep themselves comfortable. Claire stood, preparing to leave. They'll be watching us. Always. Making sure we stay quiet about Nevada. Let them watch, Sarah said. We know what we did. We know what we saw. And we know humanity is capable of rising above its worst instincts when someone's willing to take the first step. Over the following months, Sarah returned to her position at O'Hare. Controllers who'd been there during the incidents treated her differently. They'd heard rumors, whispers of something classified, something that explained why the objects had suddenly stopped appearing. She never confirmed anything. Just did her job, guiding aircraft through skies that felt simultaneously safer and more monitored than before. Emma started 2nd grade and developed a fascination with astronomy. She'd stand in their backyard at night, small telescope pointed at stars, asking questions about whether anyone else was out there. Sarah would sit beside her daughter and think about holographic warnings and battle-scarred objects descending through Nevada darkness. Mommy, if aliens are real, do you think they're watching us? Sarah pulled Emma close. I think if they are, they're hoping we figure things out before it's too late. Figure what out? That we're all on the same team. Every person on Earth. That the things that divide us, borders, politics, fear, those are choices. And we can choose differently. Emma thought about this with the seriousness only children can bring to cosmic questions. Are we going to be okay? The question hung in the cool night air, weighted with significance Sarah couldn't fully explain. She thought about Marcus Webb learning to speak again through sheer determination. About Dr. Park developing new technologies in his Alaskan exile. About Jessica training the next generation of pilots to think beyond protocol. About David analyzing intelligence with the perspective of someone who'd seen humanity from outside its own assumptions. I don't know, baby. But I know there are people working every day to make sure we are. People who refuse to give up even when things seem impossible. 6 months after Nevada, Sarah received an email from an encrypted address. No sender name. Just a link to a news article about a joint scientific initiative, American, Russian, Chinese, European researchers collaborating on climate change solutions. Buried in the 3rd paragraph was a quote from an anonymous Defense Department official. Recent events have reminded us that some threats transcend national interests. Sarah smiled. The message was getting through. Slowly. Imperfectly. But moving. Because that was the real lesson of those terrifying weeks when American skies filled with impossible objects. The threat wasn't technology or surveillance or even war. The threat was humanity's willingness to let fear drive decisions, to choose tribalism over cooperation, to mistake the familiar danger for the only danger. Russia had deployed advanced drones to exploit American vulnerabilities. But something else had been watching too, something that had seen countless civilizations face the same choice: evolve or perish. Grow beyond fear, or be consumed by it. Sarah had chosen evolution. 6 people in a Nevada desert had chosen growth over protocol, courage over career, humanity's future over personal safety. They'd been punished with silence and exile and classified files that would never see daylight. And they'd do it again without hesitation. Because the real victory wasn't stopping the Russian drones or even glimpsing something beyond human understanding. The real victory was proving that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could still choose to be extraordinary. Marcus Webb would never fly a fighter jet. But he was learning to walk again, one painful step at a time, refusing to let his stolen future define his present. Alicia worked beside him every day, turning her brother's tragedy into motivation for neurological breakthroughs that would help thousands. That was the answer Sarah had been searching for. Not whether they'd won or lost, succeeded or failed, but whether they'd responded to impossible odds with impossible courage. They had. And somewhere in the vast darkness beyond Earth's fragile atmosphere, something watched and continued hoping that humanity would choose wisdom over weapons, cooperation over conflict, survival over pride. The choice, as always, belonged to every person willing to make it. Sarah stood in her backyard, watching Emma trace constellations, and understood that her daughter's generation would face challenges that made Russian drones look like children's toys. Climate change, resource scarcity, artificial intelligence. Challenges that required humanity to think as one species rather than fractured nations. But she also knew that within humanity existed people like her team, imperfect, scared, but unwilling to let fear become destiny. People who'd break rules to save lives, risk everything for strangers, choose hope when despair seemed rational. That was humanity's real defense system. Not satellites or fighter jets or intelligence agencies, but ordinary people making extraordinary choices because the alternative was unacceptable. Emma turned from her telescope. "Mom, do you think we'll ever actually meet them? The ones watching?" Sarah thought about holographic warnings and mathematical messages and battle-scarred objects that had traveled impossible distances to deliver a simple truth. You are not alone, but you are responsible. I think we will when we're ready. When we've proven we can take care of our own planet before we venture to others. When we've learned to see each other as family rather than enemies. How long will that take? As long as it takes. But every person who chooses courage over fear, every act of defiance against division, those add up. Your generation will continue what we started. Emma nodded, returning to her telescope with the absolute faith children have that adults are telling the truth. Sarah hoped she was. Hoped that the impossible thing they'd accomplished in Nevada was the beginning of something larger, a shift in human consciousness that would ripple forward through time. The sky was clear and full of stars. Some of them circled by planets. Some of those planets might harbor life asking the same questions, facing the same choices, hoping the same hopes. Sarah whispered into the darkness. "We're trying. Tell whoever sent you that we're trying." No answer came. But she hadn't expected one. Because the answer would be written in human choices over years and decades and generations. Written in whether Emma's children inherited a world worth living in. Written in whether humanity chose to grow up before it destroyed its only home. The Russian drones had been a test. The other objects had been a reminder. But the real challenge was internal, whether fear or hope would define the future. Sarah Mitchell, former air traffic controller turned accidental hero turned silenced witness, chose hope. And if you followed this story to its end, maybe you'll choose it too. Because the world needs people willing to act when action seems impossible, to speak when silence is easier, to hope when despair feels rational. If that resonates with you, if you believe extraordinary courage lives inside ordinary people, consider subscribing to this channel, because stories like this remind us who we can become when we refuse to accept who we are. The lights in the sky had taught humanity a lesson it desperately needed. we are not alone in the universe, but we are alone in our choices. And those choices will determine whether we join the cosmic community, or become another cautionary tale whispered across the stars. Sarah tucked Emma into bed that night, kissed her forehead, and returned to the backyard. The swing moved gently in the breeze. The stars watched in silence. And somewhere in a Pentagon filing cabinet, classified files documented the night 6 people decided that saving the world was more important than following rules designed to prevent exactly that kind of salvation. History would forget them. But the future they'd helped preserve would remember in the only way that mattered, by existing at all. And that, Sarah realized with quiet satisfaction, was enough.